Okay, um, welcome everybody to the Climate Convergence Forum today, the state of our planet today and building an international climate justice movement. I think we're live on Facebook and we're live on Zoom. Okay, good. My name is Thomas Davies. I'm an organizer with Climate Convergence Vancouver. And before we get going with our program, I wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that we're on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, and that we need to have that centered in all climate justice organizing that we're doing, especially in occupied countries like Canada, and I think hopefully we'll learn about in New Zealand as well. We have a really interesting and important program today. We've got speakers who are organizers in Peru, in Brazil, and in New Zealand, as well as here in British Columbia, Canada. And we really wanted to make an effort to connect these struggles and to make sure that we understand that we're part of a larger global movement and that a lot of the forces and the interests that we're fighting are the same. But the things that we're fighting for as well are the same, and that we have real strength in numbers and we have real strength in what the majority of people around the world are fighting for. We're fighting for a sustainable, livable planet. We're fighting for healthy societies. And we're just fighting for human decency and humanity itself. So we wanted to do our best to bring people together, especially in times like global pandemic, where physically, even locally, it's hard to come together. We are no longer having large mass gatherings and haven't been able to for many months. But we do have this opportunity with these webinars to kind of bring people together, break through the isolation and learn and join together. So I really want to thank everybody who's logged on today, and also thank our speakers, who I'll give kind of more in-depth introductions to each of them as we go through, but they're participating in different countries, in different time zones, and taking time out of their organizing to share what they've learned and what they're doing here. I just want to let people know that the kind of general schedule we're going to be keeping is that I'll do a short opening about basically what's going on here in British Columbia. And then we're going to be having Francisco KELVIM from Brazil speaking, Siri Anderson from New Zealand, JHONATAN ERIK Rodriguez MACUYAMA from Peru, and then Allison Bodine, who's a climate convergence organizer locally speaking. After the speakers, who I'll be speaking for between 10 and 15 minutes, we will have time for discussion. For this, there'll be a Q&A and a chat box. You can type in your questions and we'll ask them to some people are able to say, some people have to get back to organizing, and we understand that. And then, yeah, we'll see what kind of questions and what kind of discussions are generated. I also wanted to thank Francisco and JHONATAN because they'll be speaking in English, which isn't their primary language. So we appreciate you making the effort and communicating with us. I know when I try and speak in Spanish, I'm not always able to articulate things as well as I'd like, but we really appreciate you making the effort to take the time and to also do that for us. So thank you. So I'm going to do a bit of an opening, a little bit so that the speakers know what's going on in British Columbia, and I think a bit of an update for people locally who are organizing. In British Columbia, the primary campaign, I think, for a lot of us has been the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. We've been fighting against that project for a decade now. The latest updates have been that there's been some small movements towards the start of construction, but there's also been response and organizing to each of those. I was in Kamloops this weekend, and you're able to see that they're trying to clear parts of the forest and parts of the wood next to the road, and try to put pipe down. But there was also a new protest camp established in Kamloops by Secwepemc people in resistance to the pipeline expansion and the pipeline project. Locally in Vancouver, we've had the Burnett River Protection Camp, which set up in a very kind of sensitive ecosystem where there was a stream and a forest, and where Trans Mountain had kind of a short construction window before the salmon fish spawning season, and they had where they had a permit to construct in that time. And through having an organizer, having people take turns in the trees and having a camp set up, we're able to make sure no construction happened in that area in that deadline, and are still kind of making sure and seeing what is happening, because we're sure that Trans Mountain is not just going to stop, and they're going to try and find some other way to keep building the pipeline. So we're kind of in a situation where they're trying to move forward with the actual construction, and people are working really hard to make sure that this project doesn't go forward. We're also in the midst of a provincial election that was called, and we're reminded that the Site C Dam, which was a big issue in the provincial election 4 years ago, which if constructed would flood the last remaining best agricultural land, and also, just as importantly, the Indigenous nations territories there who have not consented to have their territory flooded. And the provincial government, the NDP had promised and had made a lot of comments, and that they were not going to go forward with the project, but still have. And every time we get an update about the project, it's billions and billions of dollars over budget every single time. And they're having huge problems with the seismic, with the rocks. It's not safe. And we're making that an issue again in this provincial election, and reminding the provincial government of its broken promises. So there's a lot going on in British Columbia. We've had to adjust, like everybody has around the world, to find different and creative ways to organize. But I'd say that we're finding ways, and that the movement to not just to stop these projects, but to build a better world and to build a sustainable world, I think is still strong and still learning. And I think is really going to benefit from understanding what's going on in other countries and what the other organizers in different countries are going to be able to inform us about. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. His name is Francisco Kelvin. He's a member of the National Coordinating Body and International Relations Collective of the Movimiento de Antejidos por Barraguens, which is the MAB, Movement of People Affected by Dams, an organization founded in Brazil in the 1970s. Most recently, MAB convened the first continental meeting of people affected by dams with the slogan for water, energy, and sovereignty of the peoples, which took place in Panama between the 24th and 27th of September. The main objective of the meeting was to evaluate the process of building the MAR and Latin America, to analyze the Latin American situation, and to reaffirm the resistance in the territories against dams. So Francisco, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. We would like to thank you for the invitation. My name is Francisco Kelvin, and I am a member of MABI and MAR in Latin America. And I work in the state of Rondônia, that is border with Bolivia in the middle of the Amazon. And I act in the collective of international relations of MABI. And MABI, it's a Brazilian social movement present in 21 of the 27 Brazilian states, and organized people who were affected by mega projects such as dams, meeting, and fighting against transnational corporates from a lot of different countries. So I will try in this participation to talking about a little about the current situation in Brazil, which help us to understand the size of the crisis in which the country lives, following on from the environmental crisis, the climate crisis that we are experiencing in the country, and how we have been acting in Brazil, and finally about the MAB's struggle at that time and the fighting of MAR. First, I think it's important for talking about Brazil, say that Brazil is experiencing a tragedy at this moment. We are experiencing a convergence of deep crises. First, the economic crisis. At this moment, we have more than 12 million unemployed people and 30 million informal jobs in the country. We are talking about 40 million people without basic live conditions at that moment. And this situation comes before the pandemic. The situation is aggravated by the liberal government policy, and this is early the pandemic. Second, the health crisis, really huge what is happening in Brazil. At that moment, the country has more than 5 million cases of COVID-19 and almost 150,000 deaths by COVID, the pandemic, by the COVID-19. We are only behind the United States and India, and the government continues to deny the seriousness of the pandemic and to take a stand against science all the time. Third, the supply crisis that is happening right now in Brazil. The rise in the dollar price, there is really huge in that moment. The devaluation of the real, our money in Brazil, makes many kinds of food and producers prefer to export food with the government incentivated this at that moment. This has caused an increase in the price of the food and the lack of some food like rice in the country. And the deep environmental crisis that Brazil is happening in the country. Since the coup in Brazil in 2016, we are in an agenda of freezing public spending, destruction of control and expectation bodies, and the reduction of environmental laws begin. Like the Minister of Environmental, they are like finished this in government Bolsonaro. And of course, we are living in a country government by Bolsonaro, an authoritarian government, fascist government that it is a murder and pursues. It is political oppositions, making the social and indigenous movements and discredited science and the facts. Why we say that moment that we are living in Brazil and around all the world is a climate crisis. Why that name is it's so appropriated for the moment that we live. The world in Brazil have already passed their point of return. Now it is not just a question of stop the destruction, the deforestation, emissions. This is not enough. Now an agenda is needed to reverse what has caused it. It is the reason why we call that moment a climate crisis. And Brazil, under Bolsonaro government, has been the worst government for the environment. First, because since the election campaign, it has their speech is for end the conservating areas like national parks, the indigenous lands. He's encouraged crimes against forests and deforestation for production, soy and cotton, for example. Because of this, Brazil has been the third country in the world where most environmental activists are murdered, such as Nicinha and Dilma Ferreira from MABI in the Amazon. Nicinha was a militant of MABI. She was murdered here in Rondônia in the same area, at the Madeira River, where I am in that moment. Under the government Bolsonaro, the Amazon has lived for 2 consecutive years in records of deforestation. New areas for the forest every day have been opened for to replace soya and cotton. Bolsonaro offers and encourage that in the Amazon, large corporations in the coming years intensifies deforestation, meaning dams, culturings, transnational culturings for all the worlds and include from Canada too. There are in that moment in the Amazon. The tendency for the Amazon, if this continues, is that it will lose the ability of regulate the world climate, and absorb greenhouse gases. And it is important to defend the Amazon in that moment. And this is not just a question of Brazil; it's a question for all the world. At MABI, we have organized and prepared ourselves for an event worse than this moment. And we are only the protagonists of people in collective ways can reverse this crisis. Staying organized in that moment is essential, and in our land, in our territory. So fighting for defend our land in that moment, it's something really important in our agenda. And this is very hard in Brazil and in the Amazon. In Brazil, we in the face of the pandemic, we have organized solidarity actions across the country, donating food and supplements for people that in that moment don't have the conditions for live, the basic conditions. And we starting how can I say, we starting a tree planting campaign in our country and in the Amazon too. So far, more than 15,000 trees have been planted in Brazil by the people that were affected. And we are making this action for saying that the people want to protect the Amazon. So this is very important. And this month, the last month, we have the day of the Amazon, and we make this in 21 states in Brazil. This month, we launched our journey for the 5 years of violent crimes in Mariana, and we have a lot of findings. It was a huge crime that the mining companies like Vale and companies from other countries made in Mariana, Minas Gerais, and that killed all a basin, all the basin, the entire basin of the Rio Doce River, and those affected go on without repair. We urge everyone to participate and denunciate and pressure the government Bolsonaro and the companies because the profit is not worth the life. And we want just give a message for the people in our countries. I think in that moment, be organized is something really, really important. And in MABI and in MAR in Latin America, we are trying to make a process of formation and keeping shared experience across the countries for building an international relation movement for fighting, not just against the governments, but against the companies and against that model of society, and in the same time building other society. I think it's very important. I don't know if I have more time, but I think this is the idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisco. And I'm sure people, if you're able to stay, people will have more questions for you later. Also, if it's possible, can you post the links to your website or resources? Even if it's in Portuguese, you can translate it pretty easily, and I think people would be very interested.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. So again, that was Francisco KELVIM from MABE in Brazil. Thank you very much. And again, we really appreciate people coming from different countries, different time zones, speaking in second or third languages, to be able to share their struggles. And I think the message about needing to stay organized and be more organized is very well taken for the current situation. The next speaker I want to introduce is Siri Anderson. She is a co-director and campaigner and community organizer for 350 Aotearoa, which is the Maori word for New Zealand, and hopefully she can educate us better on how to pronounce it properly. I apologize for that. And she has an experience across a range of functions, including driving strategic campaigns, developing research with policy analysis, and building the capacity of communities to lead change. She's really passionate about supporting people-powered movements and equipping them with the knowledge and skills to create a just and sustainable future for all. She sees climate change as a social, political, and economic issue, as well as an environmental one, and is dedicated to working to achieve climate justice. And I really want to thank her for coming in on short notice. It was kind of interesting trying to find an organizer in New Zealand who's available at this time, because it's currently Thursday, and she's speaking to us from the future. And she'll have to leave after a little after she speaks, but I really want to thank Siri, and she can take it from there.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's such an honor to be here, and it's so important to be having these conversations, especially in times of crisis, when it can feel like the world is very much falling apart, to recognize that there are people all over the world doing really important work, and we all make up the ecosystem that is the global climate justice movement. And so I think massive thank you to you guys at Climate Convergence for putting this on, and for for giving us the opportunity to report back from our countries and also hear what's going on around the world. Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to share a little bit, some perspectives and some reflections on the climate justice movement in Aotearoa, New Zealand. You did a great job at pronouncing it. I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm sharing very much personal reflections here, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the climate movement in Aotearoa, because it is incredibly diverse, and so many different communities are represented in there. And I can speak from my personal experience with 350 Aotearoa, but also as an individual who comes from a middle class, able-bodied background from a high-income country, and I wanted to acknowledge my privilege in this space. Just start off with that. Yeah, I thought just to speak a little bit to kind of the current context in terms of climate in New Zealand, and then speak to some of the challenges I feel like we're facing, particularly in terms of reckoning with climate justice and what that means in our context. I think probably first to acknowledge politically, our current government, which is led by Jacinda Ardern. I'm sure lots of you have heard of Jacinda. She has a lot of international acclaim for being quite a progressive leader. And it's safe to say that through her term in government, she's currently in a coalition with the Green Party and another not very progressive, more business-oriented party. But nonetheless, there have been quite a few legislative changes in the past term, which have really progressed climate change and climate action in New Zealand. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but had a climate change ministry created. We've had legislation introduced that provides a legislative framework for meeting our obligations under the Paris Agreement. They've introduced a ban on offshore oil and gas exploration and introduced a framework for mandatory reporting on climate risk. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that while these are kind of small steps, I think it's the government has shown leadership on climate, and I think that reflects also the mood of the country. We've really seen in the past few years, I think we've really seen climate change and kind of the impacts really burst into public consciousness in the country. And I think, for example, the school strikes, the climate strikes are a huge moment where hundreds of thousands of people got onto the streets. And I think we really need to celebrate that. And I think we need to acknowledge that as a really important step forward in kind of public awareness around climate change. I think politically, while there have been steps forward in addressing climate change, and Jacinda has quite famously come out and said climate change is the nuclear moment of our generation. I think the government's understanding and probably the broader understanding of climate justice and what climate justice means is probably quite lacking still. And in the sense that there have been legislative advances in, for example, providing pathways to reduce emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. Jacinda's government has been quite heavily criticised by the Maori community for not doing anywhere near enough to respect Maori as treaty partners, as equal partners in governing and being custodians for the country and the environment. Also wanted to acknowledge the influence of global movements like Black Lives Matter. I think that it's been very interesting to see how it has sparked conversations within the country and within the public around how issues of racial justice in and of themselves are important, but also how they intersect with climate change. And I think it's also been a really important moment within the climate movement itself to kind of take a moment to reflect on where we're at and how we can be better in advancing racial justice as an integral component of climate justice. And I think just to sum up, like the broad context in New Zealand, I would say I think the beginnings of the conversation around recognizing climate change as a justice issue and as an issue which intersects with so many other challenges that we face and that communities around the country face. I think that's a good step forward, and I think that there's still a lot of work to do, however, for people to see climate change, to understand that if you do care about climate change and if you want to act for climate change, you also need to act for other issues like racial justice, like disability justice, like Indigenous justice. So I think positive steps forward, but a lot of work needs to be done. So just to talk a little bit to some of the I guess, to drill a little bit deeper into some of the challenges that we face as a climate movement in Aotearoa. Again, I want to acknowledge that that I'm speaking from the perspective of an organisation and as an individual that holds a relative amount of privilege and power in this space, and that my experience is probably different to other organisations who might represent communities who experience disadvantage or marginalisation, and that their perspectives are as valid. And it's a shame we couldn't bring we weren't able to get some more people to speak today, but great to be having these conversations. As I mentioned before, I think it's great that climate change has really burst onto the scene as an important issue. I think lots of polls that say that climate change is one of the most important issues within the public consciousness in New Zealand. But yeah, lots of work needs to be done to really encourage people to understand that climate change intersects with so many other challenges. I think it's interesting, we at 350 have really put in a lot of effort to advancing the understanding within our organisation of justice and what that means in our context. I think, Thomas, you've mentioned obviously that we're a colonised country, and so what are our obligations under the treaty? What are our obligations as partners? How can we make sure that Māori have a seat at the table? How do we make sure that their voices are meaningfully considered and a part of the process? And I think that that's something that we've been trying to do internally, but I think we also have a responsibility, and that others in the climate movement also have a responsibility to be having that conversation publicly as well, and to ensure that the people who are following us for climate news are also being taken on a justice journey to understand the intersections with other issues. I think it's interesting to note we often get pushback when we are talking about issues beyond climate. We'll sometimes get angry emails being like, why are you talking about Māori rights, or what does this have to do with climate change? And I think that we as an organisation within the climate movement and the climate movement as a whole have a responsibility to be really talking through that. I think that it's important to recognise that the climate movement in New Zealand is very much dominated by large, predominantly white middle-class NGOs, and that that they take up a lot of space and a lot of power and a lot of resources. And I think there's still plenty of work that needs to be done for people within the climate movement to understand exactly how we can diversify the voices that we're hearing, diversify the perspectives that we're hearing, ensure that the right people are inputting into the conversations that we're having. I think we need to do a better job around understanding that good intentions aren't enough, and that you can still do harm. You can still do harm to communities that experience disadvantage or marginalized communities. And yeah, we have to move beyond thinking that wasn't my intention, but then go on to recognize that our actions have real impact and can cause real harm for communities. I think that for organizations that are on a justice journey, as we all, I would say most of our organizations are in New Zealand, I think there's a lot of lessons in understanding how we can build trust and relationships with frontline communities, communities that are experiencing disadvantage and marginalization. And I think that we have to learn to work at their pace. We have to learn to build trust, and we have to learn not to tokenize and not to, in the worst case scenarios, not to exploit their voices. It's not enough to have a Maori voice in the room if they're not involved in the process of decision making, if they're not involved in the processes whereby you develop your strategy. It's not enough to tokenize somebody in that way. I think there's lots of challenges in terms of really embedding that understanding into our organizations. And I think that we all need to spend time to reflect more on our accountability. And I think real accountability comes from deep reflections about who your organization is and who you represent, and why you are accountable to whoever it may be. I think that it's a massive challenge to be willing to give up power or to give up space, to hold space for others, especially when you come from a perspective where you do have a lot of privilege and power. Giving it up can be a challenge. And so understanding why you're doing it in the first place is a really, really important first step. I'm getting close to time, I think. So many lessons that I'd love to share. I think we need to be willing and open to be self-reflexive within the climate movement as climate organizations, and understand why we're in the place that we are today. I think when you recognize that you have power and privilege, you also, I think, come to an understanding that you have a responsibility to act and to hold space for others. And I think it's really hard work, and it makes you feel uncomfortable. And I think that's a sign that you're probably going in the right direction if you're not feeling completely comfortable. And yeah, I realized I didn't really talk too much about what we at 350 have been doing. So just a quick minute on what we've been doing specifically in New Zealand. So a lot of the struggles that you were sharing, Francisco, around mining in communities, like direct mining, it is happening in New Zealand, but it's not happening on a scale that we see in countries like Brazil and Peru and other countries. So there are definitely frontline struggles, but I think, and there are definitely organizations within New Zealand who are doing that work. We have been really focused on turning off the finance that goes to fossil fuel companies and trying to challenge the social license they have within our society. So we do a lot of divestment and finance campaigning, and that has been a whole range of things like getting universities and councils to divest from fossil fuels, but also we have just had a major win this year with our first New Zealand-owned bank going fully fossil-free. And I think, yeah, it's really important to celebrate those wins and see the progress that we're making in New Zealand in challenging the social license of fossil fuel companies, and then recognize that we're on the way, but that we really need to be expanding our understanding of climate justice internally and with the New Zealand public to really be making strides in this area. I will stop. I've gone over time, but yeah, thank you again for having me and listening to me prattle on. I hope that there's some useful reflections there. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else speak today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siri. Yeah, we appreciated definitely your perspective and kind of working through a lot of the challenges you have of being a respectful climate justice organization and moving forward and making sure that we're doing it in the best way possible. And I think it can give a lot of food for thought for especially, I'm sure, people that are watching in British Columbia. So I understand that you'll probably be able to stay until 6 o'clock our time, which is, I think, 2 o'clock your time in the future. Okay, good. But thank you. And yeah, just so everybody knows, Siri will disappear at some point, but it's not because she wouldn't like to say it. It's just she's got a lot of work to do, which is, we want her to continue doing her important work in New Zealand. So I wanted to introduce our next speaker, and just a reminder to people, we have 2 more speakers, and then we'll be opening it up for questions, answers, and comments. If you're watching on Facebook, you can comment on the Facebook video, and we'll be able to see that and move that in and get that answered as well. But I wanted to welcome Jonathan ERIK Rodriguez MACUYAMA. He was born in Iquitos, Peru. He studied social anthropology at the National University of the Peruvian Amazon. He also studied an official tourism guide at the Higher Technological Institute El Milagro, Fe y Alegría 43. He has an extensive experience and knowledge about Amazonian history, nature, and cultures. He is an independent artistic cultural promoter, Amazonian poet, and fervent activist for the environment and Amazonian indigenous peoples' rights. He is currently the president of the Civil Association of Amazon Art and Cultures, general director of the Amazon Sentidos magazine, a magazine of art, poetry, and literature. He has also been articulating for the realization of an international poetry festival of the Amazon. He is currently working on research titled "Shall We Indigenous Migration and the Economy of Kilometer 73 on the Iquitos Nauta Peru Highway." He is also working in his poet anthology "In the Name of Rose." So very, very busy organizer. We're very thankful to have him, and I will hand it over to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. To be sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, and we understand that there's some issues with the internet because of flooding in your region. But if you speak slowly, yes, and I'll let you know if there's a problem.
Okay, thank you. Yes, right now in this part of the Amazon rainforest, we're having a pouring rain, and that makes very hard to have connections. It's because we don't have a fiber optic connection. We just have satellite connection. I live right in the middle of the city of Iquitos, which is in the rainforest of northern of Peru. Iquitos is the biggest city in the region, and also this city is very cosmopolitan, and here we have a lot of immigration of foreigners from other countries, from other regions of Peru, and also a lot of movement of indigenous people. Just to give you a picture about my region, I live in Loreto department. This region has 51 indigenous nations, which makes the highest
Jonathan, we just lost you. If you can hear me.
Make this region very cultural and diverse in indigenous people. Just around Iquitos, we have 27 indigenous communities. So these make a very interesting place to live, and also a very important place because of the mega diversity of cultures, and also we live in the lands of the world. Here, this is one of the part of the Amazonian rainforest, and here we have also a lot of social conflicts. Just to give you a picture, one of the main social conflicts that we have here are coming from different kind of industry. The top one is the
Jonathan, we can't hear you.
The top one is the mining industry. The second one is oil industry. And also we have lumber industry here. Believe or not, even when we got the COVID-19, as in other countries, we also suffer the conflicts of this virus. But now the suffering is prolongated into the indigenous communities. We don't have a real statistics about how many people of indigenous people.
We'll wait, and then hopefully we can get a better audio connection.
That these people,
Jonathan, we lost.
Were using.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We lost you. We couldn't hear you after you said we don't have real statistics. Then we couldn't hear you for the last maybe 15 seconds.
I'm really sorry for this connection.
No. Thank you very much for. We'll just work through it. But yeah, if you could start after we lost you after. Let's see. You said we don't really have the statistics for.
We don't really have the statistic of how many people are passing away, especially into the indigenous people in this COVID crisis system here in Peru. But the Interethnic Association, the main organization of indigenous people, they are reporting that they just in the last month, they got 386 indigenous people passing away, which is a very huge amount. But in the whole Peruvian country, we're having a report is getting very worse. We are in the top of the countries that the implementation of the against the virus is not working well. These kind of things, what I'm saying is just to giving you a general picture about my country. But or brings the oil from the Amazon to the coast part of Peru is 50 years old and never was changing and refacting. And the main reports coming from official reports and national journals and news, they use the discourse trying to yell against indigenous people, and they don't comprehend all the difficulties and the social conflict what these people have. All people have a right to ask for the right payment when they work for any company. Indigenous people also they ask for a protection of their environmental rights to protect their environmental place, but the oil spills that we have in here are getting worse. Just to give you more reports about this period, just in this year, in this part of Peru, in Loreto, all the damage that we're having here because oil spill just in these few months in the past, we got 140 oil spills. Since 2019, we got a report that we're having already close to 560 oil spill here in this part of the Amazon. And those things are not because indigenous people are uh, uh, working against companies. These people are organizing because they are trying to live in a very good environment, and they're trying also to ask for a better social responsibility. It's not just this kind of responsibility coming from the government. It's also responsibility from the companies. Just to give you another information, last month from Petrotal, which is which is a company that the main investor is a Canadian company, Petrotal, they got a conflict with indigenous protesters, and one person passing away. He dies protesting against pollution right outside of the Petrotal plant. You can find out that information even in internet. This is just if we, when I'm talking with you about oil exploitation here in the Amazon, exploiting primary resource is not a good alternative for the environment, even not important for local people. Oil reaching is mainly doing and investing outside of the land of indigenous people, of to deforestate more than 2,000 hectares of lands of primary forests right here in the Amazon, 2 hours away from Iquitos City. This company, they were publicity or making marketing in website with idea to plant an organic cacao chocolate sell to Europe, even Canada or United States. So they sell outside of this country that they're doing right work here in the Amazon, working with indigenous people, working with farmer people in sustainable way. But that's not true. What these people they did, that was Cacao del Perú Norte. That's the name of that company. That company deforested more than 2,000 hectares of primary forest. And also the other ways how these people are working now, I refers about this company as they're also making land grabbing. They are using third or fourth people not linking with a company, buying lands of indigenous and farmers, and the end they take away of the real properties with idea to give economical benefits, and the end indigenous people and farmer people, they lose their land, and the big companies are getting the property of this kind of forest. This kind of complex stuff is happening here in the Amazon. And now we're having reports of illegal mining activities in Nanay River. Nanay River is one of the main rivers that feeds with drinkable water to the city. And you know, to get gold from rivers, you have to use mercury, which is very toxic for the blood, very toxic for human consumption. It's not consumption things. This is kind of pictures that I'm just telling you is very important. But there is still people, they don't care about others, and they're destroying their environment where we live. But it's not just about people, it's also about all life linking, living in just one world. Uh, since how important are a little insect even to get until huge biosphere. Here it's important, and I want to make a call to everybody who is listening to me by this way, is to take a time to reflect that the indigenous people that living here in the forest, farmers, local people, they are also suffering, attacking, not just about the state, it's also about multinational companies. They don't care about environment. They don't really care about people. Here in Peru, we having reports the environmental defenders, they are also dying because their activity. It is very interesting what is happening here in this country, and also is the same in some other Latin American countries, which where to this space, because you're giving also young people speak out, and they can make hear their voices. And also it's very important to think about in-base organization who are linking with organization, because this is another issue also running between environmental organization, foundation, that there is too much bureaucratic issues, and they forget about basic organization who are really suffering all these effects and problems, what I'm telling you right now. Thank you so much for you listening me in this time.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I appreciate you struggling through the internet connection and for bringing us the kind of perspective and the struggles, what's going on. It's very interesting for us to hear about corporations who are taking over land and are promising that and are promoting that they're doing good things for the environment and for the people, when the opposite is true. We find that over and over again around the world. Our next speaker is Allison Bodine. Before we get to her, I missed in the introduction that important thing that happened in British Columbia yesterday, the day before, but Stacy, Jim, and Tawaham were 3 Indigenous land offenders, were sentenced to 28 days in jail for their taking part in ceremonies in front of the gate of the Tmx tank farm, the oil tank farm. And these are community organizers. These are people who have really played a leading role in defending Indigenous rights, in promoting climate justice, and in bringing people together. They're the kind of people that we should be promoting and celebrating, not the people that we should be criminalizing and imprisoning. But the Canadian court system has put them in prison. On the Climate Convergence Facebook, and we'll put a link in the chat as well, is kind of a fundraising campaign for them, for their expenses and their legal expenses. So if you're able to, donate to that. But these are people that we've worked with quite closely and are special, and we need to make sure that we acknowledge what's going on to them. So I wanted to introduce Allison Beaudine. I think many people know her, but she's a Climate Convergence organizer. She's a journalist, an author, and a researcher with focus on environmental, Latin American, and immigration issues. Most recently, Allison's articles have been published internationally by Venezuelanalysis, Global Research Council, Hemispheric Affairs, Common Dreams, Orinoco Tribune and Counterpunch. An emphasis on her research has been the disastrous impacts of war on the environment, and she has spoken out at international conferences in Latin America and the United States. So I wanted to welcome Allison and hand it over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone, or good night. I know it's getting pretty late for our guests from Brazil and from Peru. Thank you all for joining us. This idea to have this webinar has really come about because in some ways the pandemic has really ingrained in us just how much our struggles are related to one another. And we understand, and we've been talking a lot about in Climate Convergence, how much more we need to know about what other people are organizing around the world, because it helps us all be stronger, because it inspires us, it empowers us to know that we're fighting the same struggles, whether we are in the Amazon or here in British Columbia or anywhere around the planet. The destructive forces that are really out to prevent the future of humanity on this planet are the same. And we have a lot to learn from one another. So I really want to thank everyone for their time here tonight, and for our speakers. I know, Jonathan, that probably it was very frustrating for you to have trouble with the internet, and so we appreciate you working through that and for staying for the discussion. I encourage people to open up for discussion. We'll answer as best we can, but it's all about laying the foundation during this time of difficulty for our continued work together. So I wanted to start my contribution today by picking an easy target. And that easy target is ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil is one of the world's largest oil and gas companies. They operate on every continent in most countries around the world. And they're also really illustrative, I think, of the 100 companies that make up 71% of greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, I'm going to target them because they are the worst, but the patterns of what they've done to the globe and to humanity are the same as many other large companies like them. In the 1970s, ExxonMobil, it's been discovered, knew very well about global warming and its devastating impact. That means for 50 years, they pumped greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, expanded, made insane and completely unnecessary amounts of money for shareholders, and destroyed an unknown number of species, destroyed the lives of hundreds of thousands of millions of people. One of my first memories actually is a National Geographic magazine with a bird covered in oil. And of course, that's from the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989. Exxon ExxonMobil since then didn't learn a whole lot. Spills still happen. Still cheaper to spill oil than it is to come up with new ways to give energy. And now we have a situation where most companies and corporations around the world are shifting due to public pressure, due to this mass movement, towards saying that they can help build this so-called greener future. But I also want to call attention to an article from just last week in which ExxonMobil papers revealed, Bloomberg News actually revealed, that by its own assessment, it has a $210 billion investment strategy for the next 5 years that has its global yearly emissions rising by 17%. We're talking about the entire greenhouse gas emissions of the country of Greece being what ExxonMobil plans to dump into the air. So I want us to think about that as I go through a bit of the state of our planet today. Think about where was the government oversight in 50 years? You know, if we're relying on the moral qualities of the shareholders in companies like this, where were they? And now is the condition so different? Or are we still right to be saying we're not going to put our trust in these companies to build this so-called greener future that they say they are going to do? That can we and will we put our trust in the capitalist system, in fact, to bring us into this greener future, or even to prevent the extinction of humanity? So let's think about this as we talk about the state of the planet today. Very, very brief timeline of the history of Mother Earth. 3 points. 4.5 billion years ago, Earth was born. Humans, somewhat related to who we are today, came 300,000 years ago, talking about Homo sapiens mostly. And then capitalism emerged from feudalism about 275 years ago. Today, 2020, the carbon cycle, the amount of carbon particles in the air are the highest they have been in 450,000 years. Methane is at its highest levels ever recorded, and not just recorded by humans, but recorded in rocks and in the geology of our Earth. Yet, the amount of emissions and carbon that's been dumped into the air just in the last 50 years, out of the 300,000, you could say, that humans have been around, shows us exactly the damage that the capitalist system has had in its existence. That little blip of time on this really great historical timeline. Just this summer, as the world has been facing a pandemic, as Francisco and Jonathan both described, as Siri talked about, the pandemic has impacted people around the world disproportionately. Poor working people, people of color. At the same time, our Earth has also been crying out. Melting ice, the largest intact ice shelf in the Canadian Arctic, broke off. It was bigger than the island of Manhattan. By the year 2050, the World Bank says 143 million people will be displaced by the effects of climate change. Here in British Columbia, we can barely go outside for part of the summer. It's a small impact compared to what other people face, but a drastic impact when you've never experienced that before in your life, due to forest fires in California and Washington that have killed people. Many Pacific Island nations have begun already to see their waters rising. And we're talking about countries where 97% of people live within 10 kilometers of the coastline. They already know that the sea level is rising, and they've already seen it impact their life. As Francisco said, the climate emergency, the climate crisis is already there. It's nothing that we're waiting for. And I think all of these, and also the global temperatures. In the Arctic Circle, there was a measurement over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Or in Baghdad, Iraq, a country that's already been decimated by US war and occupation over the last 16 years, they had days in a row where it was impossible for most to even go outside due to the extreme heat. We're looking at a planet where certain parts of it are going to become unlivable. Even the pandemic itself illustrates just how far off balance our relationship with nature has become. When humans move closer to forests, when humans move closer to wild areas, new diseases are created. Animals live closer to humans in a way that hasn't happened before, and new organisms come about that we're not going to be able to avoid. We can only expect more pandemics to happen, and the terrible impact of the capitalist mismanagement of healthcare to redouble itself in the years to come. We are already living in a critical and an emergency situation. It's been exposed more and more in rich countries like Canada or the United States or New Zealand, as we were talking about, throughout this pandemic. But the simple facts of inequality and growing inequality are everywhere. To say the least, that the richest people in the world have actually had their wealth increased by 27% throughout the pandemic, while so many have lost their homes or their lives around the world. I think that the climate justice movement has to have a long view of history, which is why I started out with some perspective of when humanity came about. We have to understand that the system that we're living under is not the end-all be-all. It's not our only solution to how we can continue to exist on this planet. I think it's actually the largest impediment. It's what stands in our way to continued existence of humanity. And that's why we have to have this long view of history, to know that humanity's existence on this planet has changed many times. We've experienced life under many different systems, and that we are ready and prepared to move on to the next if we are going to survive. We have to have this long view of history and also a clear conception of the interconnectedness of humanity. This brings us to building an international climate justice movement. As we've talked about tonight, our struggles are the same. And I think that every local action that people take, from people in trees here in Burnaby, British Columbia, standing against the Tmx Pipeline, to workers and peasants in Brazil, blocking the development of hydroelectric dams, to Indigenous people in Peru, fighting against oil spills. Every local action is important and contributes to the whole, but it only becomes important once we know about it, once we're able to build real solidarity between peoples. When we're ready to target the same governments, the same corporations, and the same model of society that really is dictating the future of all of us on this planet. And so clearly, with what Jonathan was saying, we see the Canadian government's mining and exploitation, and how that makes us our responsibility as people here in Canada to stand with people from Africa and Latin America, other regions of the world, where Canada is stealing the wealth, leaving environmental destruction behind, so that we can live have a higher level standard of living here. In 2016, a study showed there were at least 709 cases of criminalization and 44 deaths, including 30 targeted deaths carried out by Canadian mining companies in countries in Latin America. And Canada has the same mode of operations in over 100 countries around the world through mining and other resource extraction projects. We understand that there's not one country, not one group that will be able to solve the climate crisis by ourselves. It's a global crisis that requires a global solution. Climate change impacts people indiscriminately, but not evenly. Poor, working, and oppressed people around the world will and are being impacted the most severely. The devastating impact of the destruction of the environment by capitalism has shown us clearly that we have to be international in order to build international cooperation, solidarity, and unity across borders to become a powerful and effective force. We must build a network of our local struggles and stay connected to build an effective protest movement. Now I want to go back and think again about ExxonMobil, no matter how Angry, I know it makes us all. And this time I want to travel to the boardroom of ExxonMobil. I think we can all imagine what that looks like and who's represented there. And to really understand and to see how actually the decisions of life on Earth are being made by that corporate board, who you know has an ear with the President of the United States, with the Prime Minister of Canada, with imperialist countries around the world. I'm not being cynical, but we have to understand that if the capitalist system continues, if those boards continue to make the decisions about the future of life on Earth, we will not be able to save the planet from destruction. Yes, there are more companies with more social awareness or greener policies than ExxonMobil. But we're not talking about just needing to reduce a little bit of our impact. We're not talking about needing to stop polluting just a fraction more. We're talking about needing to completely reverse how the system that we live in works. And I say that capitalism has a structural problem, that in fact capitalism is structured to destroy Mother Nature. And we can see it around us. I think we cannot turn a blind eye anymore, that we cannot, that we have a responsibility, especially here in Canada and the United States, to look at the destruction right in the eye, to look at soil that is depleted and poisoned, to understand that water is full of lead, of medicines, of plastic, of contaminants, that air is polluted with CO2 and methane and all other kinds of gases that have tremendous health impacts, that the smoke from California came to British Columbia, went to Europe, and continued its journey around the world, makes it clear how connected we are. That energy in all of its forms is largely privatized and only accessible to some, let alone it's destructive against the environment and our Mother Earth. That food, human energy, what we need to survive, that there's structural problems with the way food is produced, land grabbing, as was discussed, the use of cows, the meat industry in Brazil. The level of hunger in the United States has almost tripled between 2019 and August of 2020. That is a microcosm of what happens around the world, because the US is one of the richest countries in the world. And you know why? Because still today, over 1/3 of food grown in the United States is thrown away. And that's the same everywhere around the world. It's predicted that by 2020, over 800 million people, nearly 1 billion, 1/7 of the world, will be going hungry. And yet there's food everywhere. So it's not a problem of how to produce what humanity needs. It's a problem with how it's produced, and it's a problem of how it's distributed. And it's a question, really, of what our society considers to be rights. Basic human rights: food, healthcare, shelter, education, self-determination. These are rights that need to become priorities for us as climate justice activists. More generally, resources from our Mother Earth have all been turned into a commodity. And one of our organizers in Climate Convergence pointed out to me recently billboards that are up around Vancouver. And these billboards advertise raspberries to bears. But that's basically what we're doing. We've taken everything, food that should just be there for consumption, and turned it into something for sale, into something that makes profit. In this level of society, the scale of what is required will not come about in negotiations between governments or directly with corporations. I'm talking about the little that has changed since Kyoto or the Paris Accords in 2015. The scale of changes we need to make would make entire countries and governments bankrupt. A global emergency shutdown, much larger than what we saw as a result of the pandemic, needs to happen in order to reverse the tremendous impact on our planet. And I say that capitalism is incapable of following through on the scale of what is needed, because if it did, it would no longer be capitalism. To end on a lighter note, I've probably gone way over, I'm sorry, Thomas and everyone. The Beaverton, which is a newspaper here in Canada that writes stories that are not true, but shine a very good light on many situations, is definitely worth sharing, because it's an illustration for me of capitalism's structural problem with a lot more clarity than I am able to express. The story, which I'll post in the chat, involves a situation in which the government of Alberta has announced a sweeping plan to increase the size of Alberta's VHS industry. So the old videotapes that we all used to use, in order to give an economic boost to the province. They're going to pump a bunch of money into making VHS tapes. They say Alberta is committed to removing the red tape, which has held those black tapes back for so long. Alberta's VHS producers are vital to creating a bright and prosperous future for our province, in which everything will be exactly like it was in the 1990s. Talk about government subsidies, lessening of regulations. It's funny, but if you replace that with the fossil fuel industry, it's also true, as we see with the level of the government of Canada's investment in the fossil fuel industry, even as people in Canada are dying because there are not proper protective equipment nor testing for COVID-19 here. So I encourage people to read the article and think about how it's not just a Jason Kennedy problem, the Premier of Alberta. It's not an Alberta problem. And that the VHS isn't just a stand-in for fossil fuel industries or oil, because this is a description of the absurdity and utter backwardness of capitalism. Capitalism, as I said, has a structural problem. Capitalism is structured to destroy Mother Nature. And this is not the instrument that we need to prevent the ruin of Earth and of our own extinction. Capitalism is on the path to an unfathomable disaster for humanity. But I think that with an international climate justice movement built on solidarity, understanding, and mass struggle, we can stop it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Allison. I'm just going to remind everybody, we're moving to the question and answer comment portion of the webinar. If you have questions, answers, comments, you can post them in the Q&A chat box below, or you can put them in the Facebook chat if you are watching on Facebook. Allison, you're not muted if you're wondering if you're muted. And I just wanted to, something I was thinking about when Allison was speaking is all the energy. I think we're all here really committed to fighting and making sure that we can have a sustainable and livable planet. And we spend so much time fighting for these things. You wonder what would happen if we had governments that were actually encouraging and facilitating these things and were helping community organizations. Not only would we be able to use that time and energy to bettering the world, but if you have the capacity and the institutions of these governments, or the capacity of these corporations that are so wasted on destroying the planet, so wasted on war, occupation, environmental destruction, the capacity of the The human race is massive or positive. We can do incredible things, but we need to be in a position where we're not constantly fighting governments, constantly fighting corporations, and constantly living under a system which doesn't prioritize our lives, our safety, our planet, our humanity. And I think something that's highlighted to me is that I'm very thankful for the speakers who come and who've beamed in from far away. Is that it's been really special to see people fighting, see people like our own age who are leading struggles, who are committed to struggles, and who have like very similar perspectives, and also like have really kind of deep understandings of their local issues. So I think we have learned a lot. I'm just gonna check through the chat box to see what we have. And I just, Jonathan, I didn't ask you, but if you have, and Francisco, you posted their website, but if you have like the Twitter and the Facebook that you can post as well, and Jonathan as well, just so people can follow up with your organizations and what you're doing. I'm just looking through the chat and the Q&A to make sure I had everything. While I do that, Jonathan or Francisco, did either of you have any kind of impressions or things you wanted to share just based on what you'd heard from the other speakers, or things that you felt that you could have covered more during your presentation?
Just one question. Okay, nice. I think there is something really important in Allison's speech about that moment that we are living. We have an international dispute for Latin America and for all research that exists in the countries of Latin America. Why we have companies like we have companies from Canada. I remember, for example, one that is called Yamana. There is in a gold mining company from Canada, from Toronto, that has a lot of dams in Brazil. Why they are mining in Brazil? Because we have countries that support this kind of things, that invest in that kind of things, and companies that buy that gold in other countries. And I think we are in a moment that we have a huge economic crisis. So the trend is more exploration of this resource. And I think moments like this, of talking with people from other countries and give solidarity and know about the fighting that they are doing in their countries, it's very, very important. And we will need this more in the next years of our fight. Just this.
And sorry, Francisco, before you mute yourself, we have a question. People would like to know a bit more in depth about the work that your organization does with Indigenous communities in Brazil that are organizing and fighting back against the Amazon deforestation and the environmental impact of the dams. Just a bit more about kind of the day-to-day work and how you're organizing.
In Brazil, MABI, the Movement of People Affected by Dams, make the fight against the construction of dams, meeting dams, dams for energy, dams from water, for water supplies. We make the fight against, because in Brazil we have a motto. In all that dams, we have the same system of violations of human rights, and all dams in all states, in all country, they do these violations of human rights and destroying the environment, and we don't have the rights of the people that were affected. So we organized the families that were affected before the construction for fighting for their rights against the project. But our fight, sometimes we, how can I say, we lose the fight. So we try to organize the people for have their rights, like people that were affected, and they take their land. So we fighting with that people for the rights, for other lands, for other house. That's our fight in Brazil. In that moment, we are in a hard moment, in a difficult moment, because we have a crisis, an economic crisis, and the government, Bolsonaro, wants to make a lot of dams projects around the country. So we are fighting in that moment against that projects. And in the Amazon is the area that we have the largest numbers of dams that the Bolsonaro government want to do. So it's very, very hard. I don't know if I...
And just one follow-up question. How has that organizing changed, or what have you been, how have you had to adapt to the pandemic and to COVID? How has your mobilization and your organization changed?
We in that moment, we are doing like online meetings with the people, but it's very, 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 very hard because we have that issue of access the internet, connection with the internet. But we are trying to make online meetings, and we have areas that the people are together. The people produce, live together. Um, how can I say the name in English? It's something like, how can I say, uh, settlement areas, something like settlement areas, encampment areas that the people are together. So in that areas, we can continue making activities like presential activities. But it's very, very hard in that moment. And in that moment in Brazil, we are having municipal elections, city elections. So it's very hard, and probably we will have in the next months more and more cases of COVID-19. And for this reason, in the same time that we continue doing our fighting for basic rights in that moment, we are making solidarity actions around our country, because we have a lot of people in that situation without food and without a lot of things that it's essential in that moment uh, for live. No?
You are on mute, Thomas.
Hola.
Yeah.
I'm on mute now. Okay, sorry. Thank you very
Hola.
much. Hi, Jonathan.
Hola.
We have a hola. Jonathan, we can hear you.
Yes, Thomas. Yes, I would like to say something.
Yes, please.
According what Allison said, I'm totally agree about how capitalism as a system is destroying humankind and also the environment, because those are the main resources what capitalism wants to destroy. And that's very important to reflect about how much this kind of thing affects into local people who lives nearby a multinational company, nearby all natural resource. Indigenous people are the main protectors of environments, but also young people getting conscious about environmental issues, getting information about these kind of things. They can do also a lot of things. They can make a better world to live together, a better place to live in a good way. I want to tell to our listeners that you have to be very careful when you listen in propaganda or publicity of marketing of big companies telling you about organic issues, because here we have this problem in Tamchiyaco city, a huge deforestation with an idea of organic chocolate. Uh, this organic this organic chocolate, and also we have other companies planting oil palm trees uh, with idea to make organic oils to human consumptions. So this kind of organic propaganda is also is coming with blood of local people. That's very important that we need to care about it. If the things what these huge company are telling us is actually true.
And
We have to
thank
be very careful.
thank you. Sorry, I'm jumping in. But before you mute yourself, there was also a question about what the main environmental campaign people are fighting for in Peru. You mentioned one, but is there any other kind of central issues or projects or campaigns that are kind of central in Peru right now?
Yes, in Peru, I don't really have the right information so far, but I hear there is a lot of campaign because this time of COVID, if you have the chance to support local organizations, that should be better. In Iquitos, last month and 2 months before, we were working also as uh, supporting local people with some local medicine, and also sharing information of local medicine, what traditional medicine, what people use. That's very important to empower about local knowledge. And also it's important to empower youth organizations.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm gonna give everybody in the chat and the Q&A a chance to do one last round of questions if you've got a question or comment you'd like to make, and then I'm going to be asking the speakers to make kind of a final summary about how they want to wrap up. Again, I want to thank everybody who so far participated and taken time to learn and to share, and especially our speakers in different countries who are, I think, at least 2 or 3 hours ahead of us, so it's later for them than it is for us. And I think we're also reminded that things like internet connections that we've been able to make use of pretty readily in our organizing are challenges for many different communities around the world. We've posted some things in the chat about Jim, Stacy, and Taoham, their GoFundMe, and how to support their struggle and the issues that are surrounded there. And then I just want to remind people to follow. We'll post all of the links. We send a follow-up email after each webinar with the links to the different organizations, the people who spoke, and references to different articles that were spoken about. So if you registered for the webinar, you'll get that, and we'll also send it out over our broader email list, so you can stay updated about what's going on and with these organizations that are new to many of us. So I have one last question so far, and then we'll probably move into the speaker summaries. But
I'll probably sneak a question in too, but go ahead with Kevin.
You are allowed. So I have a question. It says, Francisco, you mentioned parallel societies. How do you maintain those under the pressures of a capitalist system?
I don't understand.
Yeah, Kevin, if you could maybe, I thought maybe I'd missed something that you spoke about. Kevin, if you could maybe elaborate on your question a little bit. Just waiting.
While Kevin elaborates, I think he's getting at something I actually wanted to talk about. I really appreciated Jonathan's point about this like so-called organic industry, and really the developed world, countries like Canada, the United States, Europe, really being very, the choices that we make. The choices that we make are it's good for us to make environmental choices, but we also have to understand really what that means. It means, one, that we're in a privileged position to be able to make those choices, to choose maybe not to have a car, to drive an electric vehicle, or to buy more expensive food, or eat locally, these sort of things. It's only for certain privileged people, even in countries like the US or Canada. And it's also just not addressing the structural problem of the system that we live in being built on the extraction of resources to create profit. And I think whether, when we say that, that means whether it's a company that calls itself organic in Peru or a company that's inorganic, they actually both are not respecting the self-determination or the real way. They are acting in order to give more privilege to people living in North America, for example, and to line their own pockets, not in the interests of people of Peru or people of Brazil or other countries. And so our understanding of the impact of our so-called like choices has to go much deeper than just feeling good about ourselves because we made an environmentally sound decision. And what I wanted to kind of ask is the ways that in Brazil or in Peru, how the environmental movement is also connected to a movement for self-determination, or a movement against reactionary governments that are allied with the United States. I think in Canada, for example, people sometimes try and make it very unpolitical, like we're all doing good things for the environment, and if there's an election, I'll choose a more environmentally sound candidate, but it's not really as much about environmental activists. We don't talk enough about the basic human rights and really being able to tie together social movements in a concrete way with the environmental movement, with the Indigenous rights movement. So concretely, I just wanted to hear more about the way that your struggle for the environment is related to the struggle for Indigenous people to self-determination, or the struggle against your governments in Brazil or in Peru.
Francisco or Jonathan, do you want to tie that in? I think it's quite interesting for people here. Allison's correct, and I think in saying that a lot of time people say that the environment is not a political issue and try not to relate other issues. But it seems like the struggle for the environment is very much tied in with a lot of other struggles and social movements in the countries that you're organizing in. Does the question make sense?
Yes. So first, I think I understand the first question. How I think Kevin is asking about the AD groups. We have an AD. We have here in Rondônia, in other states, we have an AD fund for solidarity actions, and the families involved in the struggle create a local solidarity network for the exchange medicines, food production in our settlements and resettlements areas. we organized the food production, education, the political formation of the people. So these give conditions for the people having lived living in other way, yeah, and keeping a solidarity. How can I say? Um, feeling, a solidarity feeling, community feeling. There is different. So this gives energy for the movement continues and without profit, without talking about and have the profit involved. And about the question of Alison, I think it's about the environment movements in Brazil, something like this. I understand. Now we are in a hard moment in Brazil because the government Bolsonaro is against the ONGs, non-government organizations, environment organizations. For example, today we have an how can I say an agriculture, a small produce that was killed here in Rondônia, and the president Jair Bolsonaro talking about this and said that they were how can I say in English, they were criminals. They were criminals because they were fighting for land. They were fighting for continuous in their land with their areas. So it is what is happening in that moment in Brazil. All the social movements, all the environmental movements in Brazil, they are trying to make a process of criminalization. And this fighting in Brazil in that moment, it's something really, how can I say, it's growing, the movement of the environment, because we have in the same time mining problems like Mariana and Brumadinho, that a lot of people were killed by the toxic waste of mineration, of mining. The same time we have the Amazon burning, the Amazon and the Amazon rainforest and the Pantanal burning, fighting in the country, in the national parks, in areas very, very important. And we have other environmental problems happen in the country. But Bolsonaro, the government, just say that this is not happening. And this is like a campaign against the country, against Brazil, of other countries, trying to take the Amazon from Brazil, something like this. So it is why, for this reason, a lot of organizations of Brazil, social movement, indigenous organizations, that they are in a situation right now with the pandemic, really, really hard to the indigenous people in Brazil. All these organizations, we start a campaign that is called the Fund Bolsonaro, like to cut all the investments, to cut the money that comes from Brazil, because that soybean comes to China, comes to Europe, the wood comes to China, to Europe. The meaning, the gold come to a lot of countries too. So that's important in that moment. And this campaign create an unity with these organizations right now. I don't know if I answer.
Yeah, you did, and then, yeah, for us, it's really interesting to hear how the dynamics in your country, and for us in Canada, we face kind of a different dynamic. We have a government that calls itself a climate justice government, a prime minister that says he's a feminist, that has said that the relationship with Indigenous nations is the most important relationship, and then has purchased a pipeline with almost $19 billion, which, like, there's a conservative estimate for when it would be completed, has not implemented near anywhere we had an issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women has stalled on all of the many occasions that this government has had to really stand up on the promises that it made. It hasn't, but it was a bit of a paralysis for people during the last federal election, many of who were really excited about a new government that was coming out of an era of conservative governments that spoke more like Bolsonaro, but put a lot of faith in this government, and then the demoralization of realizing that these changes weren't going to happen. And so it's been a process for people in Canada to understand and to really focus on judging a government or an individual based on what they do, not what they say, which seems like simple, but when you're looking for and you're hoping for change, people can sometimes get a bit confused. But I think it's strengthened the movement here because people have, I think, begun to understand in a more concrete way that the real changes that we are going to accomplish are not going to be as easy as simply just voting for the changes, but require building capacity, building organizations, and staying mobilized. And that's been the same with the provincial elections here. The government promised a lot of things and had campaigns that were, and supported campaigns that were really important to climate justice activists. And we've seen that we have to rely on the organizations that we build, not on promises. So yeah, for us, it's really interesting to kind of see the dynamic of different countries. Allison, did you have another? Was that your last question, or did you have another question?
No, that was it. Oh,
Awesome.
I was going to say Jonathan made it back. I think he did want to try and add something, but I think his internet just dropped again. So
okay,
we'll just invite him to close if he's able to reconnect again.
So we're gonna kind of wait and hope that Jonathan can reconnect, and then I'm gonna ask him as soon as he connects to do his wrap up. But I just want to remind everybody, if you don't already like Climate Convergence on Facebook or follow us on Twitter or on the email list, do that, and we can make sure that all of the kind of social media handles and websites of the organizations are sent out to people, and that you can stay updated on local and international issues. And just that we're going to continue. We're not going to stop focusing on the TMX struggle and against Site C and very local issues. But it's very important to us that we broaden our perspective and broaden our connections and broaden the climate justice movement. And that's going to be a real strength for learning and for organizations. So these kinds of forums are going to be continuing. And if you have like organizations or countries or things that you'd like to highlight or you'd like to learn about, please get in touch with us. If you have connections, even better. We really want to continue doing this and emphasizing that the work that we do here in British Columbia and Canada is connected very much to the work that people are doing in other countries. And the victories that we have here are victories for people around the world, and their victories are our victories, and their challenges are our challenges. And we need to own the entirety of the struggle for climate justice, own the entirety of the struggle to defend self-determination for Indigenous nations, and own the entirety of the struggle for a better world. And that might seem daunting, but in the end, it means that we're connected to everybody around the world, which is a great thing. We're still waiting for Jonathan to connect. So I'm going to ask Francisco if you have any kind of final summary, things that you'd like to share with people, or things that you think that we should be paying in particular attention to in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you, and we continue in the fight. Our social networks are in the chat. In this month, we have 5 years of violent crime in Rio Doce, the biggest environmental crime in Brazil, and we will make an international journey of struggles. and it's important to support. And I send the website when we have news and we have the activities that we are doing. It's important to have the solidarity and follow and keeping share the actions that we are making. Thank you, and I'm here. Just call me. I'm here.
Thank you so much. And Allison, if you have words to wrap up, and then you might, we might try and politely interrupt you if Jonathan comes on and we need to take advantage of his internet. But if you could share with us your summary or perspective.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that someone in the chat was asking or saying, I hope we could learn more about the situation in Canada as well. And we do have and will continue to have a lot of discussions about that. I really encourage people to join us for our meetings, and we meet on Zoom every 2 weeks and have a good portion of the meeting to just talk about the struggle for climate justice and what's happening in the world and also in Canada, and get updates from important camps and struggles. Specifically now we know about the Tmx Pipeline, or the Site C hydroelectric dam, which is something we didn't talk enough about, but I think would have a lot in common with what Francisco was saying, as far as you take something that's like so-called green or renewable energy, but you can see so clearly how it takes away people's rights, destroys livelihoods, and isn't actually being built with people in mind, but in fact with the getting more profit from the earth. So I think that there's a lot more that we'll continue to discuss and plan and organize. We know that this time is difficult. I am constantly reminded by the Minister of Energy in Alberta, who a number of months ago said, now's the perfect time to get this pipeline built because gatherings can only be 15 people. And we're facing a very similar health situation now. Canada has not taken the pandemic seriously enough with testing to actually really protect people. And so without that, we are really stuck with putting the health of our communities first and continuing to organize online. But we know there's so much we need to learn from one another to plan for the future of building really an effective international anti-capitalist climate justice movement, because we know from here in Canada that Canadians or people living here actually have the highest greenhouse gas footprint of any other country in the G20. And this government, liberal or conservative, is not slowing down its plan to really drive us to destruction. For every green initiative that they introduce, they're still kicking hundreds of millions of dollars to the fossil fuel industry. The same on the global level. So we need to look at something different, and we need, like I said, the society that's been in existence for 275 of the 300,000 years that humans have been on Earth is not the instrument that we need. The capitalist system is not the instrument that we need to build the planet that we all deserve. So thank you all for your time. I look forward to continuing our discussions. It was a pleasure to be on the panel with Francisco and Jonathan and Siri, who had to leave us. But let's keep up the fight, and united we will win. Venceremos, and I don't know how to say that in Portuguese. What's a chant, Francisco? Can you tell us a chant to end on in Portuguese?
Venceremos.
Like saying that too?
Venceremos.
Venceremos. The same. We
It's a great word, and that's a great perspective. So yes, thank you very much to everybody, and we will see you at the next webinar. And Francisco, we will definitely be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you all.